Hi everyone. I would like to welcome you to the third content webinar. As you know, we have weekly webinars. All of them touch upon a topic that's concerned in the nanodegree. And this is the third installment actually. Um, Today's topic will be the document object model, or as it is also known, the DOM. First of all, I would like to congratulate all of you that managed to complete the first project on time, or even some of you managed to do it before time. You should really be happy with yourselves because exceeding the deadlines, actually preceding them, is great because you can now work on the next project and have more time to complete it. And trust me, the second project in the nano degree is way more difficult than the first one. And actually, it's one of the most difficult in the whole nano degree. So good job on having some extra time to spend on that. Um, so enough of the introduction. Let's get into the presentation. I have made a presentation again. I will share this with you along with links to the other resources. And yeah, so let's get into this. Um, there's the presentation, and this is our topic, the document object model. As you can see in brackets, the DOM. Um, this is our agenda for today. Uh, First, we'll have a few words about the three pillars of front-end web development. Then we'll have a look at what a JavaScript object is, and see an example so we can have a clear understanding of what it actually is. Then we'll say a few words about a really important topic in software development in general, namely object-oriented programming. After that, we move on to the essence of today's webinar, the DOM. First off, we'll see a number of definitions because if you try to search for a definition online, you'll come across different definitions in every website you look in. That's why we'll take a closer look at several definitions and hope to build um, our own easy to understand and easy to use in the future definition based on all of the ones that we're gonna look at. Then we'll move on to explaining why JavaScript and the DOM are two different things. Some still make the mistake of thinking that the DOM is part of the JavaScript language, which is not true, and we will see why in a minute. After that, we'll explore an example of the tree-like structure of the DOM so you can make sense of it when someone says that the DOM has a tree-like structure. And later, we'll have a look at how the DOM is created. This is a bit of a theoretical section, which is good to know if you intend to work as developers, which I'm sure you do. After all, you're taking this nano degree, which is a bit difficult and will get you job ready eventually. After that, we'll see some code examples that make use of the DOM and interact and modify it. And finally, I'll share some resources with you if you want to further study the DOM. Okay, so let's begin. Here you can see the three pillars of front-end web development. All the websites and web applications out there are some kind of combination of the three languages you see here, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. As you can see here, HTML has its main task is to provide the structure. So if we think of our website or web app as a house, HTML will be, metaphorically speaking, the structure. So um, the foundations, the walls, all of that. CSS provides the styling. So you can think that is, I don't know, the paint or the layout of the house, how many stories it has, and something like that. So it provides the more visual part of the website. And JavaScript, as you can see here in brackets, provides the functionality, meaning that it makes our content in the website, our content, it makes it dynamic, it makes it react to user interactions, user input, and all that. So JavaScript is used to control the behavior of the elements actually. It's used to make our website interesting, and we can also style HTML elements with it too. So if you use all three languages together, we end up with a fully functioning web page which is interesting to look at and responds to users. So a big part of the reason why that's possible is the document object model, actually, the DOM. And there it is, actually, the DOM, the document object model. But why have I colored the word object in red? This is because the DOM is in fact just an object. So I thought that to get a good understanding of the DOM, we have to know what objects are and what they do. Um, pretty much everything in JavaScript is an object. That includes arrays, functions, the DOM itself, events, event handlers, event listeners, every single HTML element as well on the page is an object, and so on and so forth. Actually, the only things that are not objects are primitives. There are 6 of them, as you can see: the boolean, which is the true or false values, the numbers, the strings, the null keyword, the undefined keyword, and the symbol. Um, a primitive actually is a data type, which, as you can see, it has only properties and no methods. Also, they are read-only and cannot be mutated. What that means is that we cannot change the properties they have, we cannot add properties, we cannot use any methods on them, and that's what unmutable means. All the others that are not primitive data types, that means arrays, functions, and all the others I mentioned earlier, are mutable. So we can interact with them, we can change them, we can use them, and that's essentially what mutable means. So what's important to know is that objects have properties, which are essentially variables that have values attached to them. So we can store as many variables in the form of properties as we like, which is a very neat way to store any kind of data in our apps. So a property is essentially a key value pair. Um, we can use the key to access the value of the property. So the other thing that I want to discuss about objects is that they have methods. These are essentially functions that are stored in a variable, which is called a function expression. So these are functions that are specific to the object and are stored in a key. So instead of what the difference is between properties and methods is that the value of the key that is a method is a function. And so we use the key again to access the function. So with this in mind, let's see an example of an object. Remember that objects are mutable. We can do whatever we want with them. And this is a simple JavaScript object. It has the name person. It has 4 properties. The first name, which has a value of John. The last name, that has a value of Doe. And the age, that's a number. This is a number, 50. Whereas these are strings. This is a number. So keep in mind. And finally, the eye color is again a string that's blue. Here we have the method describe myself, which as you can see is just a function. It just returns a string here. I work as a web developer. To access any of the values, we can use a number of techniques, but essentially what's most commonly used is to access the object by typing in person. Then we put a dot at the end, and we access the value by typing out the key here. So if we want to access John, we type person dot first name, and that gives us John. The same goes for the methods. If you want to access this function, we just type person dot describe myself and put the 2 parentheses on the end so we can invoke the function. And that's what objects are in a nutshell. There's many more to learn about objects, but this is the essence. Objects are the building blocks of what is one of the most important concepts in programming in general, not just in web development. The concept is called object-oriented programming. It's impossible to explain in the little time that we have here the whole concepts and the whole idea behind object-oriented programming, but it's worth mentioning it briefly so you know that such a thing exists, and it's pretty important to learn in the future. Here we have a sample definition of what object-oriented programming is. So object-oriented programming is the process of objects interacting with one another through methods and properties. We just discussed what methods and properties are. So we have that objects interact with one another through methods and properties. We use them to store data. As we said before, we can use objects to store data in a neat way. We use objects to structure apps into modules and keep code clean and easy to understand. Okay, what a module is a part of the code that is used to construct an app. So if we have an app that has 4 modules, each and every module deals with a separate concern. So it's that way we can separate the structure of our code and make it a little bit more easier on ourselves when understanding what happens where. And that allows us to build out really structured apps that have logic in them. Here we have an image of 4 objects: the cat object, the sleep object, the play object, and the feed object. Here, the cat object interacts with the others to help enhance itself and change its properties. It uses, for example, the sleep object to boost its energy fields, but also when it uses the sleep objects, its hungry field increases as well. If it uses the play object, its mood field goes up, but its energy goes down, and it's called the meow method is called as well. And finally, the feed object decreases the hunger of the cat and enhances its mood and as well calls the meow method. That's just a childish, a bit childish um, explanation of or example of object-oriented programming. So in general, what's important to memorize is that in object-oriented programming, different objects interact with one another and change one another, and that's what modern-day real-world apps use to structure their code. Now, with this in mind, let's actually begin exploring the DOM. Like I said in the beginning, we'll go through various definitions and try to make sense of them. The first one is that the DOM is like a tree-like structure that captures the content and properties of the HTML and all the relationships between the nodes. Notice how it says the content and properties of the HTML. Remember that in the beginning I said that pretty much everything is an object in JavaScript, and that includes all the HTML elements. So if an HTML element is an object, like all other JavaScript objects, it has properties and methods. And here in this definition, we can see that the DOM is like a tree-like structure that captures the content and the properties of the HTML. So what that means is that all the HTML method elements that we write in the HTML file can be accessed in the DOM. So the DOM is a big object that has properties which include all the HTML we have written in tags converted to properties. So all the relationships between the nodes. Here we should also explain what a node is. Remember a minute ago that I said that every HTML element is an object. Yeah, so every node consists of an HTML element. So you can think of a node as like a container for an HTML element. It's just what the web browser parses the tokens to. So we'll talk about the DOM construction process in a minute, but for now you can think of a node as the container for a HTML element. So as many HTML elements are in our HTML file, there are as many nodes in the DOM. So the DOM determines the relationships between the HTML elements and constructs a tree-like structure based on these relationships. So let's see this in action. Here you can see a simple HTML file like the one you used to construct the first project. Notice how at the top we have a square that says document right here. This is the object which we use to access the DOM in the browser. This is what JavaScript uses to interact and manipulate the DOM. Remember, the DOM consists of all these tags here written out. The body, the table. Okay, so immediately after the document here, we have the HTML tag. The HTML tag tells the browser that what we are writing here is in fact HTML. It represents the root, and this is very important to get um, the root of an HTML document. Notice how there is a play of words here. We say that the DOM is a tree-like structure, so a tree. And now we have a root. So in the real world, the beginning of the tree comes from the root. So it's an interesting analogy here because it seems that the HTML tree so where the DOM begins has its roots, and in fact that's the HTML tag we see here. So the HTML tag is the container for all other HTML elements we write except for the doc type. As you can see here, it's placed in the structure above the HTML tag. What doc type is that it tells the browser what kind of document it's dealing with. Back in the days, there used to be websites written in XML, so not HTML, and we made use of this doc type tag to tell the browser what in fact it's dealing with. Is it HTML, XML, or other type of documents? Um, the HTML tag has a head tag immediately after it, so it's the parent of the head tag here. In the head tag, we use we use the head tag to put all the metadata for the website. So metadata is like the characteristics of the document. It's not something that's visible on the page. It's just a description of the website or the web app we're writing. Here we put in the title tag. This is what gets shown on the browser here as the title of the web app or the website. And we put style tags here for inline CSS if we don't want to have external CSS files. Or link tags as well here if we want actually external CSS files. And other things are also put in here. But generally, that's what most websites have. The next thing on the other column of the tree, the DOM tree, we have the body tag. It is a sibling of the head tag, so it's not superior or inferior in any way to the head tag. In the body tag, we put all the visible in the browser HTML code. Here we have a simple layout, which is just a table with a table body, some table rows, 2 of them, and in each table row there are table data tags with some text in them. In the picture, you can see how the code written on the left side is interpreted by the DOM. You can see how a tree-like structure, this here, is formed and that captures the relationships between the elements, meaning that the DOM knows which element is a child of which means that it knows that the table is the parent of the table body and the child of the body, as well as the table rows are siblings of one another. So it knows all of this. Okay, so now that we know what we mean by saying that DOM is a tree-like structure, let's have a look at some more definitions. This is what the Mozilla Developer Network, actually let's say what the Mozilla Developer Network is. That's like the main source of truth in the web developer community, and not just the web developer community, all developers in general. tend to look at this. It's a huge organization that tries to document all the changes, all the um, standards, and the characteristics of pretty much every programming language out there. So MDN, the Mozilla Developer Network, is a pretty huge thing, and I suggest that you have a very good look at it because there you can find pretty much an answer for every single question. However, it's useful to bear in mind that sometimes the definitions and the examples in MDN are quite technical and may require knowledge of some previous knowledge, which you might not have at the current moment, and that makes it a bit difficult to understand what it actually says in MDN. So uh, the Mozilla Developer Network is definitely something to keep in mind when you're searching for some kind of information. But just know that there are other sources which can help you understand it in a bit more um, easy to know and easy to understand way. Um, so what MDN says about the DOM is that the DOM is a programming interface for HTML and XML documents. It represents the page so that programs can change the document structure, style, and content. Um, let's explain this a bit here. So it represents the page so that programs can change the document structure, style, and content. So that in general, that means that the DOM is like a reference to the actual HTML code and the actual HTML elements that we've written. And if we interact with the DOM, we can access those elements and then can use some kind of programming language to change it, to structure it in a different way, to create new elements, to remove existing ones, to change them based on some kind of style idea that we have, and generate new content, of course. Um, the DOM represents the document as nodes and objects. So, as we said before, the nodes are just containers for the HTML elements, and which are themselves objects. And finally, that way programming languages can connect to the page. So we make use of scripts, JavaScripts, for example, um, to interact with the DOM. We can do that with other programming languages. Of course, some of them are Python, Java, C, Ruby, and others, of course. Okay, so if other programming languages can be used to connect with the DOM, that must mean that the DOM is not a part of any programming language. So, as you already understand, the DOM is not part of JavaScript, and you should remember that. It is a completely separate entity from JavaScript, and we only use JavaScript to manipulate or interact with the DOM. This we can do thanks to the document object, which the browser provides us with, which we can use to access the DOM and all the HTML elements. Remember, we can use any programming language we want, Ruby, Python, and all the others. But here, in this nanodegree, we're going to use JavaScript. All the others are left for a later date if you want to study. Um, so with that in mind, let's check out the final definition. So the DOM is an object-oriented representation of the web page, which can be modified with a scripting language such as JavaScript. This is again taken from the Mozilla Developer Network, so you can understand that this is true. So this definition is a bit of a hybrid between the previous two that we saw, and I think it's the easiest to remember and understand and actually use. Because as we said, DOM is an object. It's a representation of the web page, all the HTML elements, and it can be modified with a scripting language such as JavaScript. Okay, now that we have some understanding what it is, let's see how the DOM is actually constructed. When we want to see a website, what we do is to send a request to some backend server somewhere, probably in another country most of the time. And what we get as a response, so we send a network request and we receive a response, our browser actually receives a response, is the HTML of the website. We'll do that actually a bit later. Our browser receives the HTML and goes to work on it. Firstly, the bytes sent by the server are converted to HTML tags, like the ones we saw earlier, the body and all the others. The browser then examines the tags and converts them to tokens in what's called the process of tokenization. After that, the nodes are created, which contain the HTML elements, remember, and finally, the tree construction process yields the actual DOM at the end. So that's a pretty general overview of what the process of DOM construction is. I have supplied a bit of resources if you want to take a closer look at the process and maybe understand it a bit better in the final stages of the presentation. So this process here, the DOM construction process, happens every single time we try to access a website or web app or anything else like it. So it's useful to know what actually happens. And now, enough of theory. Let's look at some code. So I'll go out of the presentation, and here you can see the Google homepage. Let's first see what the document object is. Let's open DevTools and see how we can interact with the DOM. DevTools, it's a shortcut for it, can be used by typing or holding down Control, Shift, and I. That opens the DevTools. As you can see, now it's getting closed, and now it opens. Control, Shift, I. Or you can just simply right-click, open the context menu, and hit Inspect right here. So now that the DevTools are open, make sure to go to the console here, the console tab, and here we will type just simply document. There we go. And if we hit enter, let's see what happens. We get this hashtag document returned to us. Notice how the screen goes blue when I hover over it. So if we click it, lo and behold, this is actually the HTML of the Google homepage. So this is what the document gives us. Here you can see HTML language, specified. Here's the head tag with all the style, scripts, the link tags, the meta tags. This is what the Google developers actually typed out. So it's pretty interesting. Here we have all the visible content. Um, let's actually see if we can find the Google date time. All the divs, cancel, shortcuts, everything. This is all the DOM of the Google homepage, and that's pretty interesting. You can go on every single website you want, and if you're interested in finding out how it's built, you can just type here documents, and you will get the HTML documents returned. So remember, this happens every time we send a request to a server, and our browser receives this exact same structure. Okay, so that's what the document object is. Let's now flip over to CodePen. Here it is. I have constructed a little small project just to demonstrate what DOM interaction is and how we can use the document objects, methods, and properties to um, change the layout. So as you can see, I've composed a simple HTML structure and applied some really basic styling to it. There is a big div with the class of container, which houses two other divs, the one with the class list and the one with the class of boxes. So remember the relationships. The div with a class list is a sibling of the div with a class boxes, and both of them are children of the class container div. So the DOM supplies us with a lot of methods and properties, but the ones we're going to take a look at are all used right here. So right now I have commented them out so we can see what every single one does, each separately. So a few words about the CSS. It's nothing fancy really. Here you have the global resets. Here we apply some really general styling. And here we use Flexbox, which I demonstrated last week. We apply some colors, some border radius, again Flexbox. So as you can see, Flexbox is a really important tool. Here we do some aligning of the text, some padding, border radius, nothing fancy really. Um, and all of that gives us this layout here. Okay, um, the first method of the DOM we're gonna use is get elements by class ID here. As you can see, the way we access the DOM's properties or methods is to first type in document. So remember that the DOM is just an object. So to interact with it and to use its properties and methods, we do it just like we would a normal JavaScript object. Here we have to put the dot, and that gives us access to this method, which is which is a method of the document. So you should know that there are two ways to interact with HTML elements. Excuse me. One is to store them in a variable, like we've done here. We have made the Python variable, and we have used the get element by ID method of the document and have selected the Python element. As you can see here, the list item has an ID of Python. And so if we write this code, we will get this list item returned to us and we can use a variable like Python to store this HTML elements and use some kind of I don't know, attribute or method on it as we wish. So here we can change the text that we see here, Python. We can change it with the use of JavaScript and the DOM. So firstly, remember, we're gonna uncomment this line, and right now we have a variable that that has an HTML element stored in it. So document get element by ID, and here in string you type the ID. So you type this text here between the two string tags. So now that we have um, this variable that stored the HTML elements, now we have a reference to the HTML element, which, as you probably remember and should keep in mind always, has properties and methods. It's an object. So it has many properties and many methods. And one of them we can use to change the text we have here. And namely, that's the inner text property of the Python object, the Python variable, which houses the HTML elements, which is an object. And if we change it, we can do it whatever we want. So what happens here in the Python when I uncomment this line? Now I uncomment it, and there we go. Now the text is Ruby on Rails. Let's change it to something else. Okay, for example, Java. Wait a minute. Yes, there it is. So with the help of the inner text property of the HTML object that has an ID of Python, we can change the inner text that we see. So that was the first way to interact and manipulate um, elements on the page by creating a variable and assigning its value to be the returned HTML element by our DOM selection process here, and get element by ID. We can do the same thing, but in a different way. So I'll just uncomment these lines here, and bring it back to normal. Here we have Python again. And the other way is to just get the elements like we did here, and that's remember that returns the HTML element here with ID of Python, and immediately after that access some of its properties or methods. Here, that's what happens. So the text here, Python, is gonna go away, and we'll substitute it with Ruby on Rails if I uncomment this line. So there we go. And now it changes to Ruby on Rails. Again, it's the same code here, get element by ID, document get element by ID, and immediately that we access the inner text property and change it to Ruby on Rails. If we change it to Java again, it's the same. Just a demonstration. Here we go. Okay. And that's what happens. That's the way we select elements that have IDs, that we've specified IDs here in the HTML. If you have a bit more experience, you will see that it's pretty uncommon to put IDs on HTML elements. So it's really rarely used to put IDs ID attributes on HTML elements. Of course, sometimes it's essential and we have to do it, but it's mostly not the case. So let's see some other methods of the DOM object that we can use to select elements that don't have an ID. So let's just uncomment this to return it back into its normal state. And one more thing I would like to mention is that generally we use variables to store the HTML elements we select. It's really rarely used to um, do a manipulation on an element immediately after selecting it like we have here. The more common example and the more common usage is to first store the elements in a variable and do anything we want after that to the variable itself. So that's something useful to know. Um, so that's what I've done for the rest of the examples. So moving on, the next method we're going to explore is the get elements by class name. This is a bit different from get element by ID because the get elements by class name returns an HTML collection, not an HTML element. So there might be many different elements that have the same class, which is almost always the case. But there might be simply a one element on the page that has the class we've specified, and that's what's happening here. So as you can see there, we've created the boxes variable, and we've used the get elements by class name method of the document object on to get the boxes, the elements with class of boxes to get them from the HTML. And now that we have the boxes variable, which houses all um, the HTML elements that have a class of boxes, we should know that this is an HTML collection. Remember, these are not the elements themselves. So, but the main thing to know about an HTML collection is that it's something like an array. So remember to access values in an array or elements in an array, we use the square brackets and we type out the index. Remember that arrays are zero index based, so the first element in the array is accessed via the zero and not the one. That's also true for HTML collection data types. So here we have just one element in that has a class of boxes. That's why we're using here the first element, and we access its style object. So the style object is a property of every HTML element that is used to access all CSS properties of the HTML element in question. So here, the style object is an object within an object, and it has values of its own, of course. And every single CSS property that we write here, margin, padding, box sizing, font size, color, all of them are stored in the style object of the HTML element. So here we access the display property of the div with a class of boxes, and we set it to none. And that's what happens. So the div with a class boxes is this here. And if we set its display property to none, let's see what happens. And there we go. All the all its children and the box itself, the div with a class boxes, is removed from the page, so it's no longer there. Um, the the get elements by class name is used like this. Notice how we don't put any dots or pound signs or whatever that we would normally use in CSS to select these elements. This is JavaScript, and this is the method we use here in the get elements by class name. So let's put those elements back where they belong, and let's move on to the next one, the get elements by tag name. You should already guess what that does. So we have so far gotten elements that have an ID or have a class. Sometimes though, really in really rare times, you can have an element that doesn't have either an ID or a class. That's the case with these li elements here, or this one as well. This is a really high level selection method, the get elements by tag name. It selects all of the elements we specify. So what we should know is that it also returns an HTML collection like get elements by class name does. So this makes us have to use for loops if we want to select all of the elements and do something with them. So let's first select them. There we have it, a list items variable that stores the HTML collection consisting of all the li elements. As you can see, we again access the document first, and this is a method on the document object. That's very important to know. And to do something with all of the elements in the HTML collection, we have to use a for of loop. That's one of the ways you can do it, and it's generally the best way out there. So it's the most concise way to do it. Oops, I have written a bit of slashes I don't really need. So let's select this and then comment this. And what this will do is create a variable item for every single element in the list items HTML collection, and it will access each and every one, and then it will go into its style object. Remember, this is the object that stores all the CSS attributes that can be modified of every single HTML element. So here we will access the list style type attributes and remove these little dots here, which look a bit nasty. So let's uncomment this out and see if that will work. Yes, there we go. There are no dots anymore. Remember, first we created the variable list items, and then we use the document objects to access the get elements by tag name method, and we selected all li elements here in the unordered list. And for each of them, using this for loop, we access the style object and we modified the list style type property. We can change it to something else, of course. For example, square. Check that out. And there we go. Now it's a square and not a circle. Okay, so most of you, or all of you actually, can select elements like in CSS. So JavaScript, or the DOM actually, provides us with a useful method we can use to select elements on the page, just like we would in CSS, and that's the query selector method. Here, we use this again on the document object. Remember, we do that. And in the string here in the method, we pass a string with the way we would access the elements in CSS. So notice here the dot. Right now we're going to select the container, this div. So to select it in CSS, we would put, as you can see here, container, dot container, and we specify all the rules. Here we select the container div and put it in the container variable. And with the container variable, we access the style object and modify its background property. So right now the color should change, and let's see if it does. And there we go. Right now the background is different to this hex color code here. And that's the way we use query selector. This is really comfy because here we can select IDs, we can select tags, and generally what I would recommend is using the query selector, so this way you don't have to sweat all the HTML collection data types that you're going to encounter if you use getElements by tag name or getElements by class name, for example. So let's uncomment this out, this one too, and we move to the final method we're gonna explore today. This is the query selector all method. This returns a node list object. The node list object is like an array again. So on it we can use the for each JavaScript loop to apply something to every single element in it. So first off, again, we declare the variable const items. We use the documents object to access the query selector all method. And here again, we select all the li elements here. And on the items variable that now houses a node list with the li elements in it, we use a for each loop that modifies the color property of the style object that's on every single element in the node list and set it to red. Right now it's kind of purple, I guess. So let's uncomment this out and it should turn to red, and there we go. And that's in a nutshell how we can select elements with the methods that the DOM provides us with. So that's what I had to show today. I'll just comment these lines here. I'll send this pen for you to play around and get used to accessing the DOM and modifying it if you want. Other than that, let's briefly look at some resources that are helpful. This is the presentation. Let's go to the end of the presentation where the resources are. And here they are. So first off, we got the World Wide Web Community DOM Standard. It's a pretty important document. After that, we have the MDM documentation of the DOM here. As you can see, I suggest you take a look at this one because it really explains in depth what the DOM is, and it's pretty easy to understand. This one is an article of MDM again, the third one, which is again really comprehensive and easy to use. Oops. Okay, so sorry for that. This is a list of all the web APIs here again by the MDN. And finally, the document, the object we just used to interact with the DOM. MDN has written an article explaining what it is, its properties, its methods. So here there are the query selector, the get elements by class name, get elements by ID. All of them are here, and uh, you should definitely check this out to get a better understanding of what is at your disposal if you want to interact with the DOM. And that's it from me. Let's see if we have any questions. Okay, so um, as you can probably see, um, the DOM is a very important topic, and it's essential to know what it does and how we can use it to our advantage. You will be using it a lot um, in your project, which is going to come in the next weeks. I hope that this little introduction helped you understand a bit better what the DOM is. Next week, we will have a session where we will explain a bit more how we can interact and change HTML elements. Some DOM manipulation techniques will be shown. We will discuss event listeners and generally stuff that's going to help you with completing the second project. That's it from me. Have a nice evening, and if you encounter any problems, just feel free to message me. I will be here as always. I'll send all the resources that we just saw, and uh, thank you for the attention again. I hope to see you in Slack, um, being awesome and making progress on your degree. So that's it from me. Have a nice evening.